Welcome to It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 96. Hello and welcome to this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. My name is Ken Zimmerman Jr., and this is the podcast dedicated to the history of professional wrestling from 1860s to 1930s. And in this episode, I'll be discussing the other Zbyszko, Wladek Zbyszko, and his early days in America between 1913 and 1915. But first, I had planned to do this rant on the last episode, but I did not want to take anything away from the discussion about Hulk Hogan, who was the biggest star of the 1980s. I have been listening to BBC Sounds for about the past 15, at least possibly 20 years. I normally listen to BBC Radio 4 Extra. I listen to it, if not 3 or 4 times a week daily, and have been doing so, like I said, for 15 years. And the BBC, in their infinite wisdom, decided this past year that they were going to no longer make BBC Sounds, which has been available outside the UK for all this time, no longer available to listeners outside of the UK. So what they were going to replace it with was BBC.com app, which has just recently come out. And it is a far inferior product to BBC Sounds. They also have a tier on BBC.com that if you subscribe, you get more access than if you just use the free version. Well, if they had done that with BBC Sounds, if they had made that content available with the subscription, which I believe is $8.99 monthly and $89.99 a year, but the first year you can have for $49.99, I would have jumped at that on BBC Sounds to be able to listen to BBC Radio 4 Extra every day. There is no way I'm going to pay any amount of money for this inferior crap app that they've created to replace it. And I'm not the only one that thinks that. Go into the Apple Store or the Google Store and look at the reviews for this new app that has come out, and you will see everybody that used to listen to BBC Sounds finds it to be a far inferior product. So whoever made this decision in the BBC, well, let's just say it like it is, they're idiots. I understand that you want to recoup some money for the content for things outside of the UK. It makes perfect sense. I am not paying towards public television and public radio in the United Kingdom. But if you would have taken BBC Sounds and said, hey, we know that people are listening to this outside of the US, but they're not contributing to the content, so we're going to only make this available to you if you're willing to pay a subscription, would have gladly done that. Sorry to see BBC Sounds go, one of my favorite things to listen to during the week. I'm going to cover a bunch of news topics I kind of held from the last one, and there's one additional thing that's happened that I'm going to talk about. And the show notes for this episode will be available at kenzermanjr.com/episode 96, because I'll have a link to the video on one of the things I'm going to discuss. But as I announced on the past episode, the Divided Championship is now available on Amazon in ebook, audiobook, paperback, and hardcover. And the website is almost, so kenzermanjr.com, I switched web host providers after 13 years because they just continued to raise their prices, yet my service was getting worse all the time. So I would be down, my website would be down on average each day between 6 and 12 minutes. And this went on for months. I wouldn't say it was daily, but I would say it was 3 or 4 times a week that would happen. So I was getting 300-400 unique visitors each month, which was lower than what I was getting in the past. Well, since I've switched to the new web host provider, Enter Server, my stats are back up. I've had 1,000 unique visitors to the website in July, and that's with a website that's not 100% back up to what it was because I was worried that the website migration might not be as easy as everyone was saying it was. So I saved all of my posts in that, and I also thought that I had saved the media files. But when I uploaded them to the new provider, all the posts showed up. My media files did not come through. So I'm sure it's something I screwed up, not that anybody else screwed up. But I've been replacing those pictures and media files now for the past several months, 2 or 3 months now. Almost back to normal. I've got one group of categories left, or one category left to finish. It's probably about 50% done. And it did make me look at pages, which I don't normally look at that much. And some of the pages were woefully out of date. The combat sports page ended which got ended with Gotch versus Zbyszko is the last book I had published, and I have written and published 5 books since then, so I need to update that page for sure. But the website should be back up to normal at the end of August. So just to recap some of the news, something that put a smile on my face is Roman Reigns is back with WWE and he looks to be reunited with his cousin Jay. I don't know if that's when he was always planning to return or if this was a quick return based on Seth getting injured, but whatever the cause, it's great to have Roman back in WWE. And with him and Jay going against Braun Breaker and Bronson Reed, I'm hoping that's going to be a match at SummerSlam, and I'm really looking forward to that. The AEW topic I wanted to address was something that was said on the internet, and a lot of people have commented on it. And I wanted to share my thoughts on it as well. And that is somebody had compared Hangman Adam Page, the new AEW World Champion, to Magnum TA, one of the big stars of the 1980s before his tragic car accident. I think Hangman Page definitely has something. He has a star factor about him. And I've said he's one of the more compelling wrestlers when you watch the AEW show. I don't really see the comparison to Magnum TA. They were both athletic, but that's kind of where I would say it ends. Hangman Adam Page is more of a hero or a wrestler for the new modern audience. Some of the things that he says and does would not have been accepted by wrestling fans back in the 1980s. Conversely, some of the things that Magnum said and did back in the 1980s wouldn't be accepted by today's wrestling fans. So I don't really see that comparison. Yes, he has an it factor, which Magnum had. And yes, he's a big star for his company and will continue to be so. But I don't really see the comparison between Magnum TA and Hangman Adam Page. Even though I like both Hangman Adam Page and Magnum TA, it's not a slight or an insult. I just don't see the comparison. And the third, I guess, news item that I wanted to discuss, and some people have called it a botch. I don't know that it was a botch because I don't know exactly what the wrestler was trying to do. There was a ladder match at TNA Slammiversary the weekend of July 20th, I think was the pay-per-view for TNA. It was a Sunday. And they had a ladder match for the tag team title. If you listen to this show, you know I think the ladder matches are completely overdone and that there's way too many of them, and all they're doing is encouraging people to take more dangerous chances all the time. And it's only a matter of time before somebody cripples themselves, gets killed, that there is going to be something really bad happen because of these ladder matches, because they're getting taller and taller ladders. They're taking bigger and bigger bumps. And the people who are buying these ladders are buying ladders that don't break when people are hitting them, which is the worst thing that could happen. When the ladder breaks, there's a little bit of a lessening of the impact. When the ladder doesn't break, both of the wrestlers are taking all of that impact on their body because that ladder's not giving, so they're bouncing off that metal. In this match, they did a fairly common spot, which is the two partners are climbing up a ladder on either side to get the belts. And then the opponents will run and push the ladder kind of slowly over so the wrestlers can kind of figure out how they want to take the bump onto the ladders that are set up outside the ring. This spot is done a lot. Push the ladder over, the two guys fall off it, usually through tables or ladders on the outside of the ring. For this particular spot, there was ladders that were set up outside the ring, and they were set up horizontally where they were resting on the ring apron and then on something else so that, they were going to hopefully break and give when the guys hit them, so it would take a little bit of the brunt of it away from them. One of the tag team partners was AJ Francis. AJ Francis, who used to be known in WWE as Top Dollar or Top Dollar. AJ Francis, when he starts to go off the ladder, he kind of takes a leap as he's coming off, and his partner just goes flat onto the ladder instead of trying to hit it any particular way. He just turns, goes back first down on the ladder breaks, and it happens the way it should. I think, I'm not 100% sure, I don't know what he had in his mind, but the way AJ Francis leaped off that ladder, I think he was planning on hitting either side of that ladder with his feet, and the ladder would break, and then he would kind of go down to the floor, and then he would sprawl on the floor when he landed. He didn't want to take a flat bump onto that ladder for whatever reason. However, because of the margin of error involved in trying to land feet first on those, the side of that ladder, he was turned a little too much. And I guess that he tried to then get the middle rungs that you would normally climb up on a ladder instead of the two rails that hold the rungs together on a ladder. I guess he was going to then try to land with his feet on the rungs that you climb up. Well, he missed. And he landed crotch first on one of those rungs with enough height that he definitely racked himself pretty bad when he landed on it. I've heard some sources on the internet say he was seriously injured, but I can't confirm that he was seriously injured. But the way he landed, at the least, was unpleasant, and at worst might have hindered his ability to have children or could have caused significant damage to his groin area. It is only a matter of time before something like this happened. I'm sure that because he has a checkered reputation because of the feud he had with Jim Cornette and some other things he said online. There's probably a small group of people that are celebrating that he did this to himself, which is really sick. You shouldn't celebrate when somebody does something like this to themselves. I can't call it a botch because I don't know what he had in his mind, and I don't think he's spoken about it yet. I'm sure that everybody and their brother is going to want to talk to him about it. But this is what I've said about ladder matches forever and a day. These guys are taking bigger and bigger risks, and it is only a matter of time before somebody is seriously injured or killed in one of these ladder matches. For spots that nobody remembers, that people have seen these things a million times. And yeah, maybe we didn't see anybody do that one, but they are all start to blend together because there's so many of these stupid ladder matches. The only thing they have more of than these stupid ladder matches are the stupid three-way matches. And I think we've got a couple of them coming up on the next WWE show. And AEW, they love a multiple person match. So you're going to see no end of 3 people, 4 people, 8 people, you know. The more the merrier if you're in AEW. With the ladder matches, this was bound to happen eventually. And if they keep doing them, there's going to be things a lot worse than this that happen too. Somebody one of these days is going to break their neck, unfortunately. And that is tragic. The main content of this show is I wanted to discuss the other Zbyszko, Wladek Zbyszko, in his early days in America between 1913 and 1915 this week. Depending on the source, Wladek Zbyszko was born in Jadloa near Krakow, Poland on November 20th, 1891. And Poland was part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire at the time, so he was technically born in Jadloa, Austria-Hungary, which is right outside of Krakow. Wladek is 11 years younger than his brother Stanislaus Zbyszko, who was born in April of 1880. The struggle for Wladek is a very good wrestler, but he was the younger brother of one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. Stanislaus Zbyszko is the only guy Frank Gotch would not rematch with after Gotch defeated him in 1910. And one of the ways he defeated Zbyszko, besides the fact that they were wrestling catch wrestling and Stanislaus Zbyszko was not as familiar with that at the time, Gotch tackled him off the handshake in the first fall. He pinned Zbyszko in like 5 seconds because they went to the center of the ring for the typical handshake. Gotch kind of tapped his hand and then tackled him off the handshake and pinned a surprise Zbyszko. Remember, pins at that time were 1 second. And Zbyszko threatened to not go on with the match, but they talked him into it. Gotch won the second fall, which was in catch wrestling, and then Gotch would never wrestle Zbyszko again. Zbyszko stayed in the United States for 4 years trying to get a rematch with Gotch, and he is the one guy Gotch would not have anything to do with after that first match. And when Stanislaus came back to the United States in 1921, he's in his early 40s, and Ed Strangler Lewis drops the title to him, and he carries it for like 10 months, and then he drops it back to Strangler Lewis. Ed Strangler Lewis told Lou Thez that there were only two wrestlers he thought who could beat him in a legitimate contest in from the 1920s on. Stecker was a comparable rival to him in the 19 teens. In fact, when they first started wrestling, Stecker was a little bit ahead of Lewis. But after 1920, once Lewis had beaten Stecker in 1919, Lewis said the only two wrestlers he thought that could beat him in a legitimate contest were first his training partner, who worked out with him every day, Joseph Toots Mondt. But the other person he thought who could defeat him, who was not a skilled hooker but was one of the greatest shooters of all time, was Stanislaus Zbyszko, who was in his early 40s at the time. So Stanislaus Zbyszko has few peers in the history of wrestling. And Wladek Zbyszko has the distinction of being his younger brother. Wladek followed his older brother's footsteps and became an amateur wrestler in Austria-Hungary. And then he started wrestling professionally. And there are pictures of Stanislaus Zbyszko returning to Krakow in 1911. And his brother at the time was 20 years old, and there's pictures of the two of them training in Krakow. And eventually, Wladek would join. So Stanislaus was in America from 1909 to 1914, returned to Europe to fight in World War I as an officer in the Austro-Hungarian Army's Poland Division. And then after World War I, he came back to the United States in 1921, and he lived in the United States until he passed away in 1967. Both he and Wladek did not return to Poland after they retired. They continued to live in the United States. As a matter of fact, they both died in Missouri because Wladek had a farm in near St. Joseph, Missouri, and that's where Stanislaus lived his last few years. He was a widower. His wife had died before him, So Stanislaus lived with Wladek, and then after he died, he was buried with his wife in Maine. But we're jumping way, way into the future now. Now we want to we're focusing on for this week's episode is we're focusing on 1913 when Vladek joined his brother, and we're going to range up into 1915 where Vladek became really a nationally known wrestler. So Vladek's first match was in Detroit, which had a large Polish population at the time. And Vladek would not necessarily be based out of Detroit, but he would have a lot of big matches in Detroit because he had a big fan base there and he was always assured of drawing a big crowd. In fact, his first match with Ed Strangler Lewis was in Detroit in 1914, and we'll go into that in detail in just a few minutes. But he wrestles in 1913 a number of people, but he's not really wrestling anybody big name until January of 1914 when he wrestles George Lurick in a 30-minute time limit draw at the Mechanics Hall in Boston, Massachusetts. And this match was contested under Greco-Roman wrestling rules, which is what Lurick specialized in and what Wladek Zbyszko started wrestling in. Wladek was always a better Greco wrestler than he was a catch wrestler, but Wladek pretty early on started wrestling catch as well as Greco-Roman. So when Stanislaus would come back, he would come back just about every summer and go back to Krakow. And he took a couple of American catch wrestlers with him because when he came to the United States in 1909, Stanislaus was still primarily a Greco-Roman wrestler, and he wanted to learn catch wrestling because that's what he was going to be wrestling Frank Gotch in. So he was training with two training partners besides all the matches he was having in the United States. And when he would return to Europe each summer, he would take these two wrestlers with him. And so they trained with both Wladek and Stanislaus in Krakow. So from 1910 on, Wladek is wrestling both because he's getting catch wrestling lessons every time his brother comes back to Krakow. But then in Europe, he's still wrestling Greco-Roman. When he comes to the United States in 1913, he starts wrestling both styles almost immediately. He's wrestling as many catch matches as he is Greco-Roman. But because Lurick was a Greco-Roman specialist, he does wrestle Lurick at the Mechanics Hall in Boston in Greco-Roman wrestling. And a few months later, Stanislaus Zbyszko would defeat Alex Aberg for the recognized World Greco-Roman Heavyweight Wrestling Championship in Boston, Massachusetts, in the same building. They were wrestling for George Toohey at the time. After he has the draw with Lurick, he gets scheduled for a match in April 1914 with Ed Strangler Lewis. And at this time, they're both 22 years old. Ed Strangler Lewis is just starting to develop a national reputation based on his exploits in Kentucky. Wrestling fans are reading about Zbyszko, not Zbyszko. Wrestling fans are reading about Lewis and what he's doing in Kentucky because he wins the American Heavyweight Wrestling Championship in 1913 in Kentucky. Then he drops it to William Demetrol. But he has matches with Demetrol, and he has matches with Dr. Benjamin Roller. He even wrestles Stanislaus Zbyszko before Stanislaus Zbyszko goes back to Europe. I did not know that match had existed. I thought Lewis wrestles Stanislaus Zbyszko for the first time in 1921, but they actually had one match before Stanislaus returned to Europe. And I think it was Kentucky. I'm almost positive it was Lexington. In a contest where Stanislaus had a real hard time throwing the young Lewis. But we want to talk about Lewis versus Wladek. And you can already see Wladek is always kind of overshadowed by his big brother. When you're talking about him, you're almost always also referencing something his brother did or the exploits of his brother. And I'm sure that's pretty tough, you know. I never had a brother, so I've got seven sisters and two stepsisters. I don't know what it's like to be in sibling competition, with my brother. And Vladek obviously looked up to Stanislaus, but it did have to kind of be pretty hard to be always compared with your big brother and being just right underneath the things that he was achieving. But on April 7th, 1914, Zbyszko meets Lewis in Detroit. And this is supposed to be a worked exhibition. But what happened was what happened in a lot of their matches. So Ed Strangler Lewis disliked strongly two people in professional wrestling. Now, one he eventually reconciled with after their reunification match in 1928, but he had a professional rivalry with Joe Stecker, and the two of them just could not get along because of that professional rivalry. Stecker had been the best when Lewis started to gain a national reputation. Lewis finally surpasses him in 1919 when he wins one fall out of their best 2 out of 3 fall match in Chicago, but they had an agreement that if the match went over 2 hours and one person won a fall, they would be considered the winner, which is what happened. And that was the first time after 4 contests that either one of them was ever able to score a fall on the other one. But Lewis disliked Stecker for professional reasons, a rivalry. Lewis despised Wladek Zbyszko because he just didn't like him. The two of them were oil and water, and they had a hard time ever working together, and many of their matches devolved into fistfights. So when Lewis got mad and stopped cooperating or decided to shoot on somebody, he often did not put on a submission hold and cripple him like he could have. That's what Evan Lewis would have done. That's what a Frank Gotch would have done. Evan Strangler Lewis was not like that. He did not put holds on people and hurt them legitimately. He punched them. If he got mad, he started punching you. And most of the first 4 or 5 matches that Vladek and Ed Strangler Lewis ever had, and many of them were supposed to be worked exhibitions, they would devolve into fistfights. Now, they did wrestle and manage not to kill each other in the International Wrestling Tournament. They had 2 contests and they split those, but because one of them was Greco-Roman. But later on, after that tournament, they went right back to it, to the point where when Lewis got the title back from Stanislaus Zbyszko in 1922, he absolutely refused to wrestle either Joe Stecker or Wladek Zbyszko. And that's what led to the double cross of Wayne Big Munn in Philadelphia in April 1925, was the hard feelings that a lot of the promoters and wrestlers had that were affiliated with Joe Stecker or Wladek Zbyszko, because they didn't think it was right that Lewis froze them out of the title. Lewis actually never wrestled Stecker after he beat Stecker for the world title in December of 1920. But Stecker did get a title shot against Stanislaus Zbyszko in 1921. This match went like a lot of their other matches went. They were wrestling, or supposed to be wrestling, for about 20 minutes, but instead they were pulling and tugging on each other, landing forearm blows, hitting each other with palm strikes, and Zbyszko repeatedly poked Lewis in the eyes. After about 20 minutes of this, Lewis had had enough. And like I said, this was supposed to be a work, but maybe they decided to have a contest. It would not be shocking, because if Lewis didn't like somebody, he'd say, why don't we just wrestle? So whether this was a work and they just didn't like each other and started whacking away on each other, if it became a contest, I think it was a work where they just stopped cooperating with each other. But due to this lack of cooperation, and we saw a much tamer version of this during a Charlotte Flair Nia Jax match a year or two ago, probably maybe 2 or 3 years ago now, where they quit cooperating, started having a fight in the middle of the match, and then got back on track. And a lot of people said, "Oh, they were shooting." No, they weren't shooting. The match was not, the outcome of that match was not going to change. It was going to be Charlotte winning that match. They just stopped cooperating with each other and were having a fight. That's kind of what happened here. And Ed Lewis, after 20 minutes of this, said, "No, I've had enough of this," and punched Wladek Zbyszko right in the jaw and knocked him down. And Lewis was going to continue the festivities, but the fans started to charge the ring. Remember, Detroit's got a large Polish population. They just saw their hero get punched in the face in an illegal move, so they start to rush the ring. And the police have to surround the ring to save Lewis. The referee quickly disqualifies Lewis for the punch, and Lewis screams, "Well, you didn't disqualify him when he tried to gouge my eye out. I hit him in self-defense." The referee talks to the ringside officials from the athletic commission, and they decide to declare the match a no contest. But now the police have got to get Zbyszko and Lewis back to the back, and it's going to be a lot easier to get Wladek Zbyszko back there than it is to get Lewis. So the police surround Lewis and get him back to the back. Then they come back and get the referee, and they finally come out and get Wladek Zbyszko. Of course, with the outcome of that and the way things unfolded, that match made news headlines all over the United States. So both of these guys started getting a little national notoriety, but I would not say Wladek Zbyszko was a household name yet. That would come in the ensuing year when he started to take part in the New York International Wrestling Tournament. In early 1915, Sam Rockman, who had promoted wrestling tournaments in Germany and other parts of Europe, came to the United States and saw an opportunity to establish Alex Aberg, who was a Greco-Roman wrestling specialist, as the world champion replacement for Frank Gotch. Frank Gotch had retired in April of 1913 after defeating George Lurick in his last match. Aberg did not come to the United States till the following year in 1914 and had missed his opportunity to wrestle Gotch, like his mentor and trainer George Lurick got to do. But Aberg had I don't say he had a worldwide reputation because I don't think he was that well known in the United States, but Aberg was very well known in Europe as the dominant Greco-Roman wrestler of the time and had a claim to the World Greco-Roman Wrestling Championship at one time, but then lost to Stanislav Zbyszko in 1914. But Zbyszko went back to Europe like a month after winning that match. So in effect, you could say the title was vacant. At least that's what Rockman tried to spin. And he saw Aberg, since Gotch, they tried to get Gotch to come out of retirement. Gotch would not. So he saw an opportunity that if he could establish Aberg as Gotch's successor, he would have the world champion and would be able to make a lot of money in the United States with Aberg as the touring champion. So he decides to have a spring wrestling tournament with wrestlers from all over the world. So the idea for the 1915 New York International Wrestling Tournament was born. And I've written extensively about the tournament, both the spring and the fall versions, and Masked Marvel to the rescue. Masked Marvel actually doesn't come into it until the fall tournament. The spring tournament is all Greco-Roman wrestling matches. And the tournament is held at the Manhattan Opera House in New York City. And the tournament drew almost every night 6,000 fans to the Manhattan Opera House. It filled the Opera House. And a couple of the reasons it did is, one, Greco-Roman wrestling was a bit of a novelty at that time in the United States. And the matches were considered legitimate, which most of those were legitimate contests. There was one or two. I don't think Aberg and Lurick were really wrestling legitimately with each other. But overall, the tournament itself was almost all legitimate contests, and they were contested in Greco-Roman wrestling. So Dr. Benjamin Roller joins the tournament about a month in, and he is wrestling Greco-Roman, even though he's primarily a catch-as-catch-can wrestler. There's two people that really emerge as the dominant wrestlers in this tournament. Roller does well, but Alexander Aberg and Wladek Zbyszko are the two most dominant wrestlers in this spring tournament. They either defeated or drew with every single wrestler that they competed against. And both Aberg and Zbyszko defeated everyone they met in rematches. So say someone drew with Aberg or Zbyszko in the earlier match, when they wrestled them again, and sometimes they were longer because they would go finish matches to make sure there was a winner, Aberg and Zbyszko always emerged victorious. And they never wrestled each other in the spring tournament. Even though it was a round robin format, they never crossed paths until the finale, which was held in June of 1915. Unfortunately for Rockman, that match was a bit of a disappointment after drawing those full houses in that, because Aberg and Zbyszko were very evenly matched, and they wrestled 4 hours to a draw. And that they would have a rematch of that in October, but they had to take off for the summer because a lot of times in the United States during this time period, there was no air conditioning. So you couldn't have wrestling a lot of times in the summer. The wrestlers would normally take the summers off, train, go visit family, and then start back up wrestling normally around September-ish. On his way to wrestling Aberg, Zbyszko made headlines twice. Once because he defeated Dr. Benjamin Roller in their Greco-Roman wrestling contest, which was not really an upset, but it was an upset for a lot of the fans who weren't familiar with Greco-Roman wrestling and were shocked that someone with Dr. Roller's national reputation could be defeated relatively easily in this Greco-Roman wrestling match by Wladek Zbyszko. Wladek also made news because he knocked a wrestler out during one of their matches. As I said earlier, there were representatives from many of the countries around the world in this tournament. And the representative from Greece was a gentleman by the name of Gus Karvaris. And Karvaris was a pretty skilled Greco-Roman wrestler. So towards the end of the tournament on June 2nd, 1915, Zbyszko is going to wrestle Karvaris. And this is a finish match, so there's no 30-minute time limit or anything. And Karvaris puts up a pretty tough match. It takes Wladek 35 minutes to finally get this guy in a hold, but he gets him in a reverse body hold and picks him up off the ground. So the guy's head is towards the ground, his feet are towards the air. And he is afraid that he's going to get slammed. So he reaches down and grabs Wladek Zbyszko's leg, which is a clear violation of the rules, and is trying to pull himself back down to the ground. And the referee is ordering him to release his hold. And Karvaris will not release this hold. So finally, the referee disqualifies him. Well, Wladek tells him, okay, let go, I'll put you down. The guy still is holding on to Wladek's leg. And Wladek tells him, and trying to pull Wladek back down to the ground. And Wladek says, are you going to let go of my leg? And the guy continues to hold on to his leg. So Wladek just kind of takes a little half step forward, jumps up in the air, and lands with his body on top of this guy's body, face first into the mat, knocks Karvaris out cold. Wladek gets up, walks off the mat, and goes back to the dressing room. Now realize they're in the Manhattan Opera House. They're not in a ring. They're on mats. There's a mat on the stage, which Wladek just face planted this guy into. And that ended the match. Well, the match was ended. He had been disqualified, but that ended his night because he was seeing stars and birds after that. Why he continued to hold on to Wladek's leg after the referee disqualified him? I have no idea. But Wladek had a pretty direct way of ending all of this silliness. Wladek wrestles the match with uh, Alex Aberg, and it's a draw. So they're going to have a rematch at the beginning of the fall tournament in October of 1915. And between the spring tournament and the fall tournament, Rockman makes a couple of decisions. Even though the spring tournament was so successful, Rockman decides to take a partner for the fall tournament, and his partner is Jack Curley, who's just now beginning to establish himself as a promoter. He's at the time dabbling still in boxing and wrestling. Eventually, he would be more of a wrestling promoter than a boxing promoter. But Curley convinces Rockman to allow catch wrestling in the tournament because he tells him, the novelty of the Greco-Roman wrestling is going to wear off pretty soon. So you want to have some catch matches as well because we want to keep fans' interest. Aberg and Wladek Zbyszko wrestle in October. That match goes an hour and 15 minutes before Aberg is finally able to slam and pin Wladek Zbyszko. But it was really even up until that point. The problem is fans have started to lose interest, whether it was the long, drawn out end to the tournament that was indecisive. And remember, that's the problem with contests. Or if they had just the novelty of the Greco-Roman had worn off, they are not coming out for the tournament. So a tournament that was drawing 6,000 fans every night is lucky to draw 3,000 fans. They start going around the country to try to get more wrestlers to join, and they do eventually convince Ed Strangler Lewis to come up and join the fall tournament. But nothing really saves the tournament until they introduce this gimmick at ringside known as the Masked Marvel. He sat at ringside in late November, early December, demanding to be let into the tournament. There was lots of supposition about who this wrestler was, and finally they let him in the tournament in December. And that gimmick is really what saves the fall tournament. But Wladek Zbyszko continued to show himself very well in this fall tournament, and he becomes a nationally known wrestler at the end of this tournament. He meets his old nemesis, Ed Strangler Lewis, twice in December and January at the end of this fall tournament. The first match they wrestle is Greco-Roman, and Wladek wins that match. The second match they have is catch wrestling, and Lewis defeats Wladek in catch wrestling. Alex Aberg beats Lewis in the Greco-Roman match, but he absolutely refuses to wrestle Lewis in catch wrestling. So Lewis has no chance to gain revenge against Aberg because the only match he would have is the Greco-Roman match for the tournament. Aberg wins the fall tournament as well, but he is not recognized. The fans do not accept him as Frank Gotch's replacement. Unfortunately for Rockman and Aberg, there was a match during the summer between Joe Stecker and Charlie Cutler for the American Heavyweight Wrestling Championship. That match ends with Stecker winning his first title, but the fans start recognizing him as the world champion and replacement for Frank Gotch, not Alex Aberg. Wladek Zbyszko would go on to become a big star in the late teens and the early 20s. He was most often affiliated with the New York promotion of Jack Curley. In fact, he's the Lewis freezing Wladek out of the title shot between 1922 and 1925 is why Curley joined in the conspiracy to double cross the Goldust Trio in 1925. Wladek would be a world champion a couple times, but he never got out of the shadow of his big brother. His big brother was not even in the country in 1915, yet his shadow still kind of hung over Wladek because Aberg had lost to Stanislaus, but he was able to beat Wladek. And Ed Strangler Lewis wrestled Wladek several times and started that rivalry. But when Stanislaus came back to the U.S., Lewis never said Wladek was ever a threat to him, but he did consider Stanislaus a threat to him. History will always see Wladek as the other Zbyszko, but we should remember that that other Zbyszko was a great wrestler. So my recommendation for this week is actually what I'm going to review, and that is the Great American Bash from 1985. And there were several cards that are on YouTube from Great American Bash 1985. I think this one was from Charlotte, and it was the card that was topped by Ric Flair versus Nikita Koloff, and then Dusty Rhodes versus Tully Blanchard in the cage. And Rick memorably came to the stadium in a helicopter for this show, but I believe it was Charlotte was where this Great American Bash happened because I think they had it at the Charlotte baseball stadium that the Crockett's own because of their baseball team in Charlotte as well. So that's going to be my review. Also, is this show? Oh, one other recommendation I had has nothing to do with wrestling. It's a new Netflix show. I've watched the first 3 episodes and I like it quite a bit. So I'm going to recommend Los Gringos Hunters or The Gringo Hunters on Netflix. It's a 6 episode drama and it shows in the US people tend to think that, everybody's coming over the border into the US, but Mexico has always had the problem of fugitives from the United States crossing south into Mexico. And this show is based on a true story about a elite unit that would track down these American fugitives, often wanted for murder or serious fraudulent crimes, things like that, and would uh, deport them back to the U.S. Marshal Service. So Los Gringos Hunters, the Gringo Hunters is my other recommendation for this week. So let me get into the review. So the Great American Bash, the show opens with Buddy Landel versus Cowboy Ron Bass. And one of the things I thought was hilarious about the introductions for this is the ring announcer announced Buddy Landel from Southern California. I'm sure that that was done to make him less appealing to the fans of the South, that you have this, blonde haired Californian coming in here ripping off their hero, Ric Flair, by calling himself the Nature Boy. But if you ever heard Buddy Landel talk for 5 seconds, you know that he is not from California. He has a distinct Tennessee accent that you cannot miss. And the one thing about this match, I thought it was a little slow to be the warm up match for the show. At the time, Ron Bass was feuding with Landel's manager, J.J. Dillon, who used to be Ron Bass's manager. Bass was one of Dusty's buddies from Florida and was, a better than average wrestler for a big guy. I thought this match was a little bit lesser than what I was expecting. And maybe it was, Buddy was bad Buddy on this day. I don't really know, but the match was just okay. And one of the reasons I reviewed this card, I saw the highlights from this in the 80s because Pro Wrestling Illustrated, the wrestling magazine, partnered with the Crockett promotion to put out a highlight tape. It was only like a half an hour, but it showed highlights from this show. And I remembered some of the highlights from it. But back when we used to read the magazines, they would do these pictorial spreads for the big cards. And they could make big cards look really good in these magazines, whether they were or not. And I always really wanted to see this match because I knew Ric Flair as the bad guy from St. Louis. But here he was going against from a guy from Minnesota was the Russian invader. But that was the storyline. Ric Flair was defending the U.S. against the Russian invaders of Ivan Koloff, who was from Canada, and Nikita Koloff, who was from Minnesota. that storyline was compelling back then because that was in the midst of the Cold War. I wasn't as disappointed in this as I was in Super Brawl 1. So Super Brawl 1 and the pictorials in the magazine look really good. And then when you see it for the first time, you're like, oh, now I know why this card didn't do that great. The second match was kind of interesting because it was two teams that were primarily heels, although one of the team did play the role of the fan favorites or the baby faces in this match. And it was Arn and Ole Anderson versus Dick Slater and Mad Dog Buzz Sawyer. And Sawyer was a favorite of Ole's when Ole booked Georgia. And I thought it was a good match, but the crowd was fairly quiet as it was two teams that were normally heels, but in this match, Slater and Sawyer played the role of the baby faces. And they're all four really good wrestlers, which is why it was a pretty good match. The Andersons won the match on a disqualification, which isn't really surprising. And then we have what I call the filler portion of the card. So you had the six-man tag match of Buzz Tyler, Manny Fernandez, and Sam Houston versus the Barbarian, Abdullah the Butcher, and Karate Billy Graham. This is before he went back to the tie-dye and that. And they're managed by Paul Jones. And this match is immediately followed by a dog collar match between Paul Jones, seconded by Abdullah the Butcher, and Jimmy Valiant, seconded by Buzz Tyler. Just a couple of notes from these two matches is Manny Fernandez saw himself as a star and projects it. He definitely believed that he was who he said he was. And a lot of times you could make fans believe that even if you weren't the greatest worker or wrestler in the world. Buzz Tyler, who was from South Carolina, is on one of his rare forays outside the Central States territory. He was a Central States mainstay. And then Dusty was still trying to build up Sam Houston, who rolls up Billy Graham for the victory in the six-man tag match. Jimmy Valiant won the dog collar match and then was attacked by Abby. This Jimmy Valiant Paul Jones feud went on for years in Crockett. Next was the Road Warriors versus Ivan Koloff and Crusher Khrushchev, and this is a rare AWA versus NWA Tag Team Champions match. The referee disqualified both teams, which isn't surprising because nobody was going to go over in those circumstances. But the Road Warriors would join Crockett within a couple of months and be the world champions. The third to last match was Magnum TA versus Kamala, and this match could have headlined in Mid South a year earlier. Magnum body slams Kamala in the match as well as hitting him with a belly to belly suplex, but that happened after the match was over. Magnum won again. Magnum won on a DQ when Skander Akbar interfered. The second to last match, and the one that I really wanted to see when I was younger, was Flair versus Nikita Koloff. I said earlier, Rick entered the stadium in a helicopter. Charlotte Flair would later repeat that scene at the WrestleMania that she, Becky Lynch, and Ronda Rousey headlined. I think that was in 2019, but it could have been 2018. And Rick led Nikita through the match that made the most of Nikita's strength and power without exposing Nikita's limitations. I'm not sure at the end if they had to improvise on the finish. So I think that their planned finish was Rick was going to come off the top rope, body press Nikita. Nikita was going to trip over Ivan, who was laying in the ring because Ivan had jumped in and was going to do a move on Rick, but David Crockett got in the way and got hit. And then Nikita or Ivan was wiped out on the ground. And I think that was the planned finish was Rick was going to do that body uh press or yeah, the body press onto Nikita like he had done on Harley. And Harley tripped over Gene Kiniski. That was a botch spot, but he was supposed to trip over Gene Kiniski and get pinned. I think that's the same thing that they had planned here, except a fan jumped in the ring right before they were going to go into that sequence, and I think messed up the spot. So they improvised, and Rick had Nikita pick him up for a body slam, and then Rick grabbed the rope and pulled on it until he fell on Nikita in a pin position and pinned him that way. I think the other finish would have probably been better, but I think they had to make something up on the fly because of the fan. The Russians beat up Rick a little bit after the match. I think they were going to continue beating him up a little bit longer, but the fans started pressing the ring, and I think they were worried that it was going to be a riot if they continued. So they just stood in the ring while the police kind of cleared them an aisle that they could get out of there. And then they put the cage on the ring, and it was Dusty Rhodes versus Tully Blanchard. And this set up Baby Doll having to be Dusty's valet for 30 days. And the storyline would lead to Baby Doll becoming a babyface a month or two later. But this was a typical Dusty Tully match from that time period. Both of them were bleeding. Both of them beat the heck out of each other. And then Dusty would eventually beat Tully and got the services of Baby Doll as his valet for 30 days. This is a typical Jim Crockett Promotions card of 1985 and 1986. Most of it was good. There's nothing that's going to be anything you got to hide your head for. Um, there's no real botches that you can see. And overall, I still enjoyed the card. It was not as great as I probably built it up in my mind back in the day, but it was still a good card. And it's much, much better than Super Brawl. So this is my wrestling recommendation for this week is to check out that card. That's it for this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. KenZimmermanJr.com is the place to check out the show notes for today's episode. You can view the show notes for the episode at KenZimmermanJr.com/episode 96. And you can also see what I'm working on currently and a list of books I've written if you're interested in digging deeper into this era of professional wrestling. Thank you for listening today. I would also be grateful if you would rate this podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to the show. That helps tremendously with keeping the podcast visible so people who have never heard of it can discover it. And if you already have done this, thank you so much. And then if you would like to comment on this episode or ask a question, please go to KenZimmermanJr.com, find the contact page at the top navigation, and drop me an email. You can also reach out to me on Facebook. I would love to hear from you. Until next time, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.